Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if your life is not falling apart, but your divine feminine is waking up? What if the exhaustion, the emotional sensitivity, the sudden need for solitude, the deep longing for truth, and the strange feeling that you can no longer live the way you used to are not signs that you are broken? What if they are the first signs of awakening? Because divine feminine awakening rarely begins with confidence. It often begins with discomfort, with endings, with emotional unraveling, with the quiet sense that something inside you is asking to be reborn. So how do you know you are entering divine feminine awakening? And why do you feel it in your body, heart, and soul before you can even explain it with words? Chapter 1: Awakening often feels like discomfort first. There is a moment in many women's spiritual journeys that feels confusing before it feels sacred. It does not begin with light. It does not begin with confidence. It does not begin with the beautiful version of awakening people love to post about. Very often, it begins with discomfort, a strange discomfort, a quiet inner pressure, a deep emotional sensitivity you cannot explain, a growing inability to keep living the way you used to. And because it does not look glamorous, many people misread it. They think something is wrong. They think they are becoming too emotional, too sensitive, too tired, too withdrawn, too affected by things that never used to hit them so deeply. But what if that discomfort is not a breakdown? What if it is a beginning? What if the reason you can no longer tolerate what once felt normal is because your divine feminine is waking up? That is the paradox at the heart of this chapter. Divine feminine awakening rarely begins as peace. It often begins as disruption. And that disruption can feel deeply unsettling when you do not yet have words for what is happening inside you. You may suddenly feel exhausted by environments you used to manage easily. You may become more aware of emotional dishonesty, more affected by people's energy, more uncomfortable in places where you once knew how to perform, please, adapt, or stay small. Things begin touching you differently. Noise feels louder. Chaos feels heavier. Misalignment feels sharper. Loneliness feels more revealing. Love that lacks truth feels harder to tolerate. And because all of this happens before the mind fully understands it, the first interpretation is often fear. You wonder if you are becoming unstable. Why am I crying more? Why do I need more space? Why do I feel so raw? Why can I no longer keep smiling through things that once seemed manageable? Why does my old life suddenly feel too tight for my soul? These are not small questions. And for many women, they mark the first real doorway into awakening. Because divine feminine awakening does not usually begin when life becomes easier. It often begins when false comfort stops working. That is one of the deepest truths. The roles you used to survive start feeling suffocating. The old emotional patterns start feeling unbearable. The endless giving, enduring, pleasing, proving, adapting, and silencing of yourself no longer feels noble. It starts feeling painful. That pain is not always punishment. Sometimes it is your soul refusing to keep betraying itself. And that is where awakening begins. Not when you become someone brand new, but when you can no longer comfortably remain who you have been. That is why the first stage feels so disorienting. You are not fully who you were, but you are not yet fully embodied in who you are becoming. You are in between. And in between spaces are holy, but they rarely feel neat. They feel messy, tender, emotionally exposed. Like something is being peeled away from you without your full permission. You may find yourself losing tolerance for shallow conversations, losing tolerance for one-sided relationships, losing tolerance for over-explaining your worth, minimizing your intuition, pretending to be okay, or staying available to energies that drain you. This can feel like irritability at first. But deeper than irritability, it is often awakening. Because the divine feminine does not rise through numbness. She rises through sensitivity, through truth, through felt knowing, through the body saying no before the mind has crafted a polite explanation. That is why discomfort is often the first language of awakening. The soul whispers before it speaks clearly. And often, it whispers through what no longer feels bearable. What if your inability to keep forcing is not weakness? What if it is wisdom? What if the tears are not a sign that you are falling apart, but a sign that your inner world is becoming too honest for performance? This is where the first real shift happens. You begin realizing that awakening is not always a beautiful expansion at the beginning. Sometimes it is a loss of tolerance. A loss of tolerance for self-betrayal, for emotional noise, for relationships that ask you to abandon yourself, for living disconnected from your body, your intuition, your softness, your truth. And when that loss of tolerance begins, life can feel harder before it feels clearer. You may pull away from people and not fully know why. You may need more silence than usual. You may feel grief rising from places you thought were long buried. You may look around at the life you built and realize that parts of it were built around survival, not truth. That realization can feel devastating, because now you are not only awakening to your spiritual self, you are awakening to all the places you abandoned her. That is why divine feminine awakening so often begins with discomfort first. It is not just about receiving light. It is about becoming unable to live inside what dims your light. Those are two very different things. And the second one comes first. First, the system of living against yourself becomes painful. Then slowly, the return to yourself begins. This is why awakening often enters through the body before it enters through language. You feel it before you can explain it. You sense it before you can define it. You know something is shifting before you can tell anyone what is wrong. And often nothing is wrong. Something is ending. The old tolerance is ending. The old emotional habits are ending. The old ways of staying disconnected from yourself are ending. That ending creates friction. You may feel more sensitive because your nervous system is no longer willing to call dysregulation normal. You may feel more emotional because your heart is no longer willing to stay hidden beneath constant functioning. You may feel more exhausted because your energy is no longer willing to fund identities that require self-erasure. This is not collapse in the way fear interprets it. It is truth surfacing. And truth surfacing often makes the old life feel tighter before the new one becomes visible. Imagine wearing clothing that once fit you perfectly, only to realize one day that you can barely breathe in it. The clothing did not suddenly become evil, but your body has changed. Your shape has changed. Your tolerance has changed. What once fit your old self no longer fits the self emerging now. That is awakening. The life may look the same from the outside. The routines may still be there. The relationships may still be there. Your role may still look familiar. But inwardly, something has shifted. You can feel the tightness now. You can feel where you have outgrown a version of yourself. That feeling is sacred, even when it hurts. Because discomfort is often the first mercy. The first sign that your soul is no longer willing to let you sleep through your own becoming. This is why so many women entering divine feminine awakening feel like they are too much at first. Too emotional. Too sensitive. Too inward. Too affected. But what if you are not too much? What if you are finally feeling what you had to numb in order to survive before? That is a completely different story. It means your sensitivity is not dysfunction. It may be restoration. Your body becoming honest again. Your intuition becoming louder again. Your heart becoming more accurate again. And yes, that can feel uncomfortable. Because you are no longer protected by the same numbness. You are no longer buffered by the same overfunctioning. You are no longer able to bypass your own pain through being useful, agreeable, productive, or emotionally available to everyone but yourself. Awakening removes those buffers. And once it does, the first thing you feel is often not power. It is rawness. But rawness is not failure. Rawness is often the beginning of embodiment. The beginning of no longer living entirely from the neck up. The beginning of no longer making choices only from conditioning. The beginning of your inner feminine saying, I am here. I have always been here. And I can no longer let you keep living against me without feeling the cost. That is not punishment. That is love in its fiercest form. The kind of love that will not let you keep betraying yourself comfortably. The kind of love that would rather make you uncomfortable than let you stay asleep inside a life that is too small for your soul. So if you are in this stage right now, if you feel more sensitive, more inward, more emotionally honest, more tired of pretending, more aware that something in you can no longer tolerate the old patterns, do not rush to call it brokenness. Do not rush to pathologize what may actually be sacred. You may be standing in the first true doorway of divine feminine awakening. And that doorway does not always open through bliss. Sometimes it opens through discomfort first. Because before your feminine can rise in full truth, she must first make it impossible for you to keep living against her. That is the beginning. And once you understand that, the next question becomes essential. If awakening begins through discomfort, then what does divine feminine awakening actually mean at its deepest level? Chapter 2: What divine feminine awakening really means. Once the discomfort begins, once the old patterns start feeling too heavy, once your soul can no longer comfortably live inside what once felt normal, a deeper question naturally appears. What is actually happening to me? What does divine feminine awakening really mean? Not the aesthetic version. Not the social media version. Not the version made of soft music, glowing language. And the idea that feminine awakening is simply about becoming gentler, prettier, softer, or more spiritual on the surface. The truth is much deeper than that. Because divine feminine awakening is not a personality trend. It is not a performance. It is not becoming weak. It is not becoming passive. It is not becoming someone who simply waits, feels, and hopes. Divine feminine awakening is a return to truth, a return to intuition, a return to embodied worth, a return to receptivity without self-abandonment, a return to the self you may have left behind while trying to survive love, life, expectations, trauma, people-pleasing, overgiving, and the endless pressure to be who others needed you to be. That is what makes it so powerful. Because the divine feminine is not just softness. She is truth in the body. She is the part of you that feels before the mind explains. The part of you that knows before outer proof appears. The part of you that can sense dishonesty, emotional misalignment, and energetic incoherence without needing a long argument to justify why something feels wrong. That is why awakening can feel so disruptive. Because when the divine feminine begins rising, she does not ask for permission from the life you built around self-betrayal. She begins revealing it. She reveals where you have been overgiving, where you have been silencing your needs, where you have confused being chosen with being loved, where you have confused being needed with being valued, where you have made yourself small in order to keep connection, peace, approval, or safety. That is not a light realization. It is a sacred confrontation. This is why divine feminine awakening is not about becoming more emotional in some shallow sense. It is about becoming more honest, emotionally honest, energetically honest, spiritually honest. And honesty changes everything. Because once your inner feminine begins awakening, you can no longer comfortably call anxiety intuition. You can no longer comfortably call overgiving love. You can no longer comfortably call self-erasure devotion. You can no longer comfortably call emotional chaos chemistry. The old language stops working. And that is part of awakening too. You begin seeing with different eyes. Not because the world changed overnight. Because your inner truth became harder to betray. That is what many people miss. They think divine feminine awakening means becoming softer in a way the world will find easy to accept. But often, awakening makes you harder to manipulate, harder to confuse, harder to access through false intimacy, harder to keep in spaces that require you to disconnect from yourself in order to stay loved. That is not weakness. That is feminine power becoming conscious. The divine feminine is deeply receptive, yes. But receptivity is not passivity. Receptivity is not taking whatever comes. It is not tolerating confusion. It is not endlessly waiting while abandoning your own inner authority. True receptivity is sacred discernment. It is the ability to remain open without being porous to everything. To feel deeply without surrendering your center. To receive love, truth, and guidance without chasing, forcing, or proving. That is divine feminine strength. It is not loud in the egoic sense, but it is undeniable. This is why divine feminine awakening is often misunderstood by people who only understand power through force. They think power must look like control, like dominance, like certainty, like constantly doing, fixing, pushing, managing. But the divine feminine carries a different power. The power of presence. The power of embodied truth. The power of magnetism that does not need to perform. The power of inner worth that no longer begs the outer world to define it. That kind of power is quiet, but it changes everything. Because when the divine feminine awakens, you stop trying so hard to make yourself readable to people who cannot meet your depth. You stop trying to earn peace through overfunctioning. You stop believing that your value lives in how much pain you can endure, how much love you can give without reciprocity, or how much of yourself you can sacrifice to keep connection alive. You begin returning to a more sacred standard. A standard that says, my intuition matters. My body matters. My peace matters. My truth matters. What I feel is not an inconvenience. What I know inwardly is not automatically less valid just because others cannot see it yet. That is what divine feminine awakening really means. It means the inner woman, the one who knows, feels, receives, discerns, and honors life through truth rather than performance, is no longer willing to remain buried beneath conditioning. Conditioning to be good, to be agreeable, to be chosen, to be useful, to be wanted more than true, to be validated more than embodied. Awakening begins when something inside you says, no more. No more living disconnected from my own knowing. No more collapsing just to be loved. No more confusing emotional depletion with spiritual depth. No more handing my worth over to what someone else chooses to see or not see. That no more is holy. Because it is not bitterness. It is return. Return to self-trust. Return to self-honor. Return to sacred sensitivity. Return to the inner throne of your own feminine authority. This is why divine feminine awakening often feels like both grief and empowerment at the same time. Grief, because you begin seeing where you abandoned yourself. Empowerment, because you can no longer pretend not to see it. You start realizing how often you overrode your own intuition, how often you accepted crumbs while telling yourself to be patient, how often you silenced your body's no in order to maintain connection, how often you made longing holy while making your own needs inconvenient. That realization hurts. But it is also liberating. Because once you see it, you begin changing how you relate to everything. To love, to relationships, to longing, to solitude, to truth, to your own body. And that is where divine feminine awakening becomes more than a concept. It becomes embodiment. Embodiment means you do not just understand truth mentally. You begin living it. You feel misalignment faster. You notice where your body contracts. You stop calling exhaustion devotion. You start recognizing that peace is not boring, confusion is not chemistry, and being chosen is not the same as being honored. This changes what you are available for. And that is why awakening can feel like loss before it feels like liberation. You lose your tolerance for falsehood. You lose your appetite for self-abandonment. You lose your ability to comfortably live split from your own inner knowing. That can make your outer life feel unstable for a while. Because the old life may have depended on you staying disconnected from your feminine truth. But once that truth rises, it becomes impossible to comfortably return to sleep. That is what awakening really means. Not becoming someone else. Becoming unavailable for the old betrayal. This also means the divine feminine is not anti-masculine. This is important. Many people misunderstand feminine awakening as rejecting structure, logic, protection, clarity, or groundedness. But true feminine awakening is not war against the masculine. It is the healing of your relationship to masculine distortion. You stop letting distorted masculine energy rule your inner world. The harsh inner critic. The forcing, the proving, the chronic overthinking, the pressure to fix and control everything. And as that distortion softens, your inner masculine can become something else. Grounded. Safe. Present. Protective without domination. Clear without violence. That is why divine feminine awakening is really about wholeness, not polarity warfare. It is about the feminine in you rising enough that the rest of your inner world must begin. Reorganizing around truth. And truth reorganizes everything. Your relationships. Your priorities. Your nervous system. Your spiritual path. Your idea of love. Your tolerance for chaos. Your willingness to keep betraying yourself in small ways just to remain connected. This is why the awakening feels so serious. Because it is not superficial growth. It is soul-level rearrangement. The woman who comes out of this process is not just more intuitive. She is less willing to live against herself. That is the deepest sign of all. So if you are asking what divine feminine awakening really means, here is the truest answer. It means your soul is returning you to yourself so fully that you can no longer comfortably choose what dishonors your truth. It means your sensitivity is becoming wisdom. Your intuition is becoming authority. Your softness is becoming strength. Your longing is becoming discernment. Your pain is becoming a doorway back to self-honor. That is divine feminine awakening. Not becoming fragile. Becoming real. And once you understand that, the next question becomes even more intimate. Why do you feel all of this in your body, heart, and energy before you can even explain it with words? Chapter 3: Why you feel the awakening before you understand it. One of the most confusing parts of divine feminine awakening is this. You feel it before you can explain it. Long before you have language. Long before you have clarity. Long before you can sit down and say, "This is what is happening to me." First, you feel it. You feel it in your body. In your nervous system. In your heart. in the strange pressure of emotions rising without clear explanation, in the sudden need for silence, in the exhaustion that does not feel only physical, in the sense that something inside you is changing, even though the outer world may still look the same. That is one of the deepest truths of awakening. The soul often awakens in sensation before it awakens in language. That line matters more than people realize. Because many women think something is wrong with them precisely because they cannot explain what they are feeling. They assume that if the awakening were real, it would arrive with immediate clarity, with insight, with confidence, with a beautiful, fully formed spiritual understanding. But that is not usually how it begins. It begins in the body. And the body speaks differently than the mind. The mind wants narrative, definition, structure, meaning. The body speaks in signals: tightness, fatigue, restlessness, sensitivity, sudden tears, an ache you cannot logically defend, a pull toward solitude, a resistance to spaces that once felt manageable, a quiet no that rises before you have a socially acceptable explanation for why something feels wrong. This is why so many awakenings are missed in the beginning. Because women are often taught to trust explanation more than sensation. If I cannot explain it, maybe it is not valid. If I cannot justify it, maybe I am overreacting. If there is no obvious reason for this sadness, maybe I am just unstable. If I suddenly need space, silence, distance, rest, or emotional honesty in ways I never did before, maybe I am becoming difficult. But what if none of that is true? What if your body is simply becoming too honest to keep absorbing what your soul has outgrown? That is what awakening often feels like first. Not an angelic revelation. A heightened honesty in the nervous system. You begin feeling where you are depleted, where you are overstimulated, where you are emotionally unsafe, where your energy leaves your body trying to prove, please, overgive, or hold spaces that no longer nourish you. And because the body knows before the mind catches up, the first stage often feels disorganized. You may feel sad without a clear story, heavy without a clear reason, raw without a clear event. You may feel a deep need to cry, withdraw, rest, or disconnect from noise, and not be able to explain why. This can be terrifying if you are used to living through logic. Because logic says, give me the reason first. But awakening says, feel the truth first. That reversal is huge. It means your inner feminine is beginning to lead again. And the feminine does not always begin with linear explanation. She begins with sensation, with instinct, with atmosphere, with the body saying, something is off, or something is ending, or I cannot keep carrying this. These are not weak signals. They are sacred ones. This is why emotional sensitivity often increases before spiritual clarity arrives. You may cry more easily, be more affected by other people's energy, feel overstimulated by noise, conflict, performance, emotional dishonesty, or spaces that lack depth. Things that once rolled off you may now enter your system much more intensely. This is not always fragility. Sometimes it is purification. Your nervous system is no longer willing to normalize what your soul has outgrown. That can look like unexplained sadness. This sadness is one of the most misunderstood signs of awakening. Not all sadness is about something being wrong in the obvious sense. Sometimes sadness appears because old layers are coming up to be felt. Grief you never had space for. Loneliness you learned to function around. Exhaustion from years of self-betrayal. The ache of realizing how long you have lived disconnected from your own body, your own truth, your own tenderness. That sadness may not come with one obvious cause. It may feel ancient. as if your heart is remembering something it never fully got to say, as if your body is releasing a weight it has carried silently for years, as if your soul is grieving not only what hurt you, but every version of you that had to survive, without being fully met. That kind of sadness is not random. It is awakening passing through the emotional body. You may also feel physical fatigue, a fatigue that sleep alone does not seem to fix, a heaviness in the body, a need to slow down, a deep desire to stop performing, stop overfunctioning, stop pushing through everything the way you used to. Again, many people judge this harshly. They think, why am I so tired? Why can't I just do what I used to do? Why do I need more rest, more silence, more space? But the body is often wise before the mind becomes humble enough to listen. The body may be saying, you can no longer build your life through self-abandonment. You can no longer override your inner truth and expect vitality to remain the same. You can no longer constantly perform strength while neglecting your deeper emotional reality. Fatigue can be the body calling you back. Back from overextension. Back from energetic leakage. Back from identities that required you to disconnect from yourself in order to survive. This is what makes awakening so deeply embodied. It is not just a change in thought. It is a change in what your whole system can tolerate. That is why the need for solitude often rises before understanding. Suddenly, being around too many people feels draining. Too much talking feels exhausting. Too much noise feels invasive. You may crave silence, nature, room, breath, emotional privacy. At first, this can feel antisocial or strange. But often, solitude is where the feminine begins hearing herself again. Because in noise, she gets drowned out. In constant social performance, she gets overruled. In environments that demand adaptation, she gets muted. Solitude is not always withdrawal from life. Sometimes it is recovery of the inner voice. And before the mind can understand what is awakening, the body already knows. I need space to hear what I can no longer ignore. This is also why so many women feel intuition rising before explanation does. You may sense something is wrong in a relationship before you can prove it. Feel emotionally unsafe before anything overt happens. Know you need to leave a space, slow down, or stop giving, before you have a neat reason that other people will validate. This can be deeply disorienting if you have been trained to distrust your own knowing. But awakening often begins by restoring that exact trust. It begins by teaching you. You do not always need proof before truth. That does not mean abandoning discernment. It means recognizing that discernment often begins in the body. The stomach tightens. The chest contracts. The skin feels overstimulated. The whole system says, this is not aligned. Even when the mind is still trying to be polite, logical, patient, agreeable, or optimistic. That gap between body truth and mental explanation is where awakening first lives. And for many women, it feels like confusion because they have spent years obeying the mind over sensation. But what if confusion is not failure here? What if confusion simply means the body has already arrived somewhere the mind has not yet learned how to name? That is a profound shift. Because now you stop demanding instant explanation from yourself and begin respecting the intelligence of your own felt reality. You stop saying, I need to understand this fully before I honor it. And begin saying, I can honor what I feel, even while understanding is still forming. That is divine feminine intelligence awakening. Not anti-rational. Pre-rational in the sacred sense. It senses before it defines. Feels before it argues. Knows before it can fully explain. This is why awakening can feel so lonely at first. Because you are living inside sensations that other people may not see or understand. You may not even fully understand them yourself. You only know that something is changing, and the body is telling the truth before the mind can make it socially acceptable. That takes courage. It takes courage to trust the heaviness, to trust the sensitivity, to trust the silence you crave, to trust the sadness that rises without neat narrative, to trust that your body is not betraying you by becoming more honest. It may be guiding you home, home to your own center, home to your inner feminine, home to the truth that was always there beneath the noise. So if you are feeling the awakening before you understand it, do not rush to invalidate yourself. Do not rush to call yourself too sensitive, too emotional, too inward, too slow, too much. You may simply be awakening in the most feminine way possible. Through sensation first. Through the body first. Through the nervous system first. Through the heart first. And that is not lesser wisdom. It is ancient wisdom. The kind that says, before truth becomes language, it becomes feeling. And once you understand that, the next stage becomes clearer. What are the first actual signs that divine feminine awakening is beginning to take form? That is where the first two signs emerge. Your emotional sensitivity deepens, and your tolerance for what is false begins to disappear. Chapter 4, Sign 1 and Sign 2, Emotional Sensitivity and Loss of Tolerance. One of the first signs that you are entering divine feminine awakening is not outer confidence. It is sensitivity. Raw, unexpected, inconvenient sensitivity. The kind that makes you feel everything more deeply than before. The kind that changes how your body responds to people, environments, relationships, tension, dishonesty, noise, performance, emotional imbalance, and even your own inner life. At first, this can feel overwhelming. You may think, why am I so affected lately? Why does everything feel louder? Why can I no longer brush things off the way I used to? Why do certain people drain me so quickly now? Why does one moment of emotional misalignment stay in my body for hours? These are not random changes. This is often the first sign. Sign 1, emotional sensitivity deepens. And this is where many women misunderstand what is happening. They assume sensitivity means weakness. That if they are more emotional, more affected, more intuitive, more touched by energy than before, they must be becoming fragile. But divine feminine awakening does not make you weak. It makes you honest. That is the difference. Because for a long time, many women survive by overriding what they feel. They minimize discomfort. They stay available to energies that exhaust them. They smile through environments that feel wrong. They call their intuition overthinking. They learn to adapt, absorb, endure, and keep functioning even when something inside them has already gone quiet. Then awakening begins. And suddenly the body stops cooperating with the lie. What once felt tolerable begins feeling heavy. What once felt normal begins feeling invasive. What once looked acceptable on the surface begins feeling emotionally false underneath. That is emotional sensitivity awakening into truth. You start feeling the emotional field of things. Not just the words someone says. The energy underneath the words. Not just the structure of a relationship. The imbalance inside the relationship. Not just whether someone is present physically. Whether they are coherent, honest, grounded, and real with you energetically. This is why sensitivity becomes sharper. Because the divine feminine does not only hear what is spoken. She feels what is hidden. She feels the tension behind the smile. The distance behind the affection. The emotional absence behind the attention. The dishonesty behind the performance. And when she begins awakening in you, your whole inner system becomes less willing to ignore these things. That can feel exhausting at first. Because now you are not only living in the world, you are reading it differently. More deeply. More accurately. more painfully in some ways. You may find yourself more affected by conflict, harshness, emotional inconsistency, shallow interactions, or spaces where people are present physically but disconnected inwardly. You may feel uncomfortable around relationships that look stable from the outside but feel spiritually starved on the inside. This is not overreaction. This is attunement. You're becoming more emotionally and energetically attuned. And attunement is one of the earliest gifts of divine feminine awakening. Not because it is easy, because it is true. This is also why so many women entering awakening feel like they no longer fit in places they once could survive in. The energy is too loud, too fragmented, too performative, too disconnected from truth. And the nervous system begins saying no long before the mind can make a clean decision. That leads directly to the second sign. Sign 2. You lose tolerance for what is false. This is a major turning point. Because awakening is not only about feeling more. It is about being unable to comfortably tolerate what once required you to betray yourself. That includes performative relationships, shallow validation, one-sided emotional labor, forcing outcomes, staying available to confusion, overgiving for crumbs, pretending to be okay when your soul is quietly screaming no. This loss of tolerance is sacred. But at first, it can feel like your whole life is becoming harder. Because now, things you used to make excuses for begin feeling unbearable. The relationship where you always overgave. The friendship where you were only needed, never truly seen. The dynamic where you had to stay small to keep peace. The person whose words sounded loving, but whose energy always left you depleted. You may suddenly find that you cannot do it anymore. Not because you are angry, because your soul has become too honest. That is the real meaning of loss of tolerance. Not becoming more judgmental. Becoming less willing to normalize what dishonors your truth. This can show up in small ways first. You get tired faster in certain conversations. You notice yourself pulling back from spaces that once felt familiar. You stop laughing at things that once let you avoid discomfort. You stop offering explanations when what you really feel is no. The old social masks start feeling heavier. The old emotional bargains start feeling more expensive. And you begin realizing that much of what you used to tolerate was not peace. It was self-abandonment. That realization can be painful. Because when your tolerance drops, you have to face the places where you stayed too long, gave too much, or called suffering normal just because you knew how to survive it. This is why awakening often begins with irritation or fatigue. Not because you are becoming negative. Because your soul is no longer willing to keep paying the same energetic price. The divine feminine in you begins saying, no more. No more pretending. No more overfunctioning. No more earning love through depletion. No more calling emotional starvation patience. No more adjusting yourself to what repeatedly takes you away from your own center. That no more can shake an entire life. Because many structures are built around your old tolerance. Relationships may have depended on you staying silent. Dynamics may have depended on you staying available. Patterns may have depended on you doubting your own knowing. So when your tolerance ends, the outer world may not immediately understand. Other people may think you changed suddenly. And in a way you did. But not randomly. You changed because what was once tolerated is now visible to the body as misalignment. That is awakening. A woman entering divine feminine awakening often begins noticing just how much of her previous life was organized around external validation. Being liked, being wanted, being chosen, being needed, being seen in a particular way. And suddenly those things stop satisfying. Not because validation is evil, because it is too shallow to feed what is now waking up. The deeper self does not want attention without truth, connection without reciprocity, words without energy, beauty without embodiment, love without honesty. That is why shallow validation begins feeling empty. Compliments do not land the same. Attention without real depth feels hollow. Being desired without being emotionally met feels draining. Being noticed without being respected feels almost offensive to the soul. This is not pride. This is awakening into worth. Because the divine feminine does not want to be consumed. She wants to be met. And once that part of you wakes up, your whole standard shifts. You stop asking, "Do they want me?" and start feeling, "Does this actually honor me?" That question changes everything. It changes who you give your energy to, who you trust, what you call love, what you call chemistry, what you call safety. This is why emotional sensitivity and loss of tolerance are the first signs you often feel. Because awakening begins not with outer certainty, but with inner refusal. A refusal to keep living as if your body is not telling the truth. A refusal to keep calling depletion devotion. A refusal to keep staying where your intuition keeps whispering no. A refusal to keep diluting yourself so that false things remain easier to tolerate. That refusal is sacred. And yes, it can feel disruptive. Because suddenly life gets louder before it gets clearer. But louder does not mean worse. Sometimes louder means you can finally hear what was always there. So if you're more sensitive lately, if you feel people more deeply, if emotional dishonesty affects you more, if your tolerance for confusion, performance, overgiving, and shallow connection is disappearing, do not rush to assume you are becoming unstable. You may be becoming unavailable for what your soul has already outgrown. That is one of the first signs of divine feminine awakening. Not that you feel less. That you feel too honestly to keep betraying yourself the same way. And once those first two signs begin, two more often follow very closely behind. The need for solitude. And the rising of old grief that was waiting for the right version of you to finally feel it. Chapter 5, Sign 3 and Sign 4. The need for solitude and inner grief rising. After emotional sensitivity deepens. After your tolerance for what is false begins disappearing. Something else often follows very quickly. You start needing space. Not because you hate people. Not because you are becoming cold. Not because you are withdrawing from life in some dramatic, unhealthy way. But because something inside you can no longer hear itself clearly inside noise. That is the third sign. Sign 3. A deep need for solitude begins rising. At first, this can feel confusing. You may have once been able to stay constantly available. To keep replying, showing up, adapting, socializing, helping, giving, functioning. But now, your whole system starts craving something different. Silence. Distance from noise. Distance from emotional clutter. Distance from people who require too much performance. Distance from places where your energy leaves your body faster than it returns. And because this shift can feel sudden, many women judge themselves for it. They think, why do I want to be alone so much? Why do conversations drain me faster now? Why do I feel like I need to disappear for a while? Why do I no longer want constant stimulation, constant talking, constant input? But solitude is often one of the first sacred environments of divine feminine awakening. Because awakening requires listening. And you cannot listen deeply while constantly translating yourself for the world. You cannot hear the soul clearly when your attention is always being pulled outward, into noise. Expectations, emotional labor, social performance, overgiving, overexplaining, and overstimulation. Solitude creates a clearing where your body can exhale. A clearing where your nervous system can stop bracing. a clearing where your intuition is no longer drowned out by everyone else's energy, needs, and demands. This is why solitude is not always isolation. Sometimes it is restoration, a return to your own field, a return to the silence where your inner truth can finally become audible, a return to the sacred space where your feminine no longer has to adapt in order to survive. That is why this need often becomes stronger during awakening, because the old world trained you to stay externally responsive. The awakening pulls you inward, and that inward pull can feel almost like grief in itself. You may notice that things you once enjoyed now feel draining, not because they were evil, but because your system is becoming more discerning. You may feel less interested in surface conversation, less able to tolerate social masks, less willing to spend energy in spaces that ask for your presence, but do not nourish your truth. That is not antisocial. It is sacred economy. Your soul is learning where your energy belongs. This is especially important for women who were taught that constant availability equals love, worth, goodness, or emotional maturity. For them, solitude can initially feel selfish. It can feel like disappearing, abandoning others, or becoming difficult. But often the opposite is true. Solitude is how you stop abandoning yourself. It is where the fragmented parts of you begin returning, where your body finally gets to speak without interruption, where your inner feminine no longer has to shout over the world to be heard. And once that space opens, another sign often rises with it. A much deeper, heavier, more sacred one. Sign 4. Inner grief begins surfacing. This is where many awakenings start feeling emotionally intense. Because once the noise lowers, once the solitude gives your soul room to breathe, feelings that have been buried for years can begin rising to the surface. Old grief, old heartbreak, old loneliness, old shame, old unmet needs, old versions of you who were silenced, unseen, overused, overgiving, abandoned, or forced to survive without softness. This can feel deeply overwhelming if you do not understand what is happening. You may think, why am I grieving things I thought I already healed? Why is old pain coming back now? Why do I suddenly feel sadness that seems bigger than the current moment? But awakening does not create grief from nothing. It often reveals grief that was already there waiting until you became safe enough to feel it, waiting until the version of you who could finally hold it began to emerge. That is one of the most compassionate truths of all. Not all buried pain rises because you are getting worse. Sometimes it rises because you are finally becoming ready. Ready to witness what you once had to numb. Ready to feel what you once had to function around. Ready to sit with the ache of what your heart endured while trying to remain lovable, strong, useful, or calm for everyone else. That kind of grief is sacred. Not because pain is holy in itself, but because truth is holy. And grief is often the truth of what was never fully felt. The truth of where you lost yourself. The truth of where your body said no and your life kept saying yes. The truth of relationships that took more than they gave. The truth of the child inside you who learned to adapt before she learned to rest. This is why inner grief can feel ancient. It does not always belong only to one event. It can feel layered, like generations of silence, like years of overgiving, like a whole identity built around holding pain gracefully without ever being fully held in return. That is why when grief rises during divine feminine awakening, it often comes with tears that seem disproportionate to the moment. Because the tears are not only for today. They are for every time you swallowed yourself to survive yesterday. That is powerful. And it is one of the reasons solitude becomes so necessary. Because grief needs room. Not fixing. Not rushing. Not explaining away. Room. A place where the body does not have to keep pretending it is fine. A place where your heart can finally say, "This hurt. This cost me. I needed more than I received. I have been strong for so long, but strength was not the same as being met." These realizations can be devastating and healing at the same time, because grief, when honored, is not only pain. It is truth returning. Truth about what mattered. Truth about what was lost. Truth about what your inner feminine has carried silently for far too long. This is why awakening often brings buried emotion to the surface. Not because the soul wants to wound you, because the soul wants to free you. And freedom requires honesty. It requires letting hidden pain stop ruling from the shadows. It requires feeling what was once too threatening to feel, because your life depended on functioning, adapting, or staying needed. This is why many women entering awakening suddenly feel old memories returning, old relational pain rising, old emotional patterns becoming impossible to ignore. They may feel themselves grieving not just people, but identities, roles, versions of self that were built around endurance instead of truth. You may grieve the woman who kept overgiving, the girl who thought being chosen meant being safe, the self who kept shrinking to keep connection, the part of you that waited for love while abandoning your own knowing. This is not regression. It is release. And release often comes through sorrow before it comes through peace. That is why this stage is so holy, even when it feels dark. The divine feminine does not awaken by skipping grief. She awakens by becoming willing to feel it. Because grief softens what armor could never heal. Grief opens what performance could never reach. Grief tells the truth of what mattered, what hurt, what was lost, and what can no longer be denied if wholeness is truly going to return. This is why women in awakening often feel both more inward and more emotional at the same time. They need solitude because the outer world is too loud. And they need solitude because something buried is rising. The solitude holds the grief. The grief deepens the awakening. The awakening changes what the soul will now allow. And that changes everything. Because once you have sat with your grief honestly, you become less willing to betray yourself again just to remain loved. That is where the next sign begins. Not only are you more sensitive, not only do you need more silence, not only is old grief surfacing, something even more irreversible starts happening. You can no longer betray yourself comfortably. Chapter 6, Sign 5. You can no longer betray yourself comfortably. There comes a point in divine feminine awakening when something inside you becomes impossible to ignore. It is not always dramatic at first. It is not always loud. It does not always arrive as one big decision that changes everything overnight. Sometimes it begins as a quiet ache, a deep discomfort, a subtle but growing pain that appears every time you say yes when your soul means no. Every time you overgive when your body is already tired. Every time you smile through what hurts, stay in what drains you. Explain away what your intuition already knows. Or make yourself emotionally available to what repeatedly dishonors you. And slowly, something becomes clear. You can no longer betray yourself comfortably. That is the fifth sign. And it is one of the most powerful signs of all. Because before awakening, many women have learned how to survive through self-betrayal. Not because they wanted to. Because they had to. They learned how to overextend. How to stay patient in places that were starving them. How to call self-abandonment love. How to call emotional depletion devotion. How to stay soft on the outside while hardening silently inside. They learned how to make themselves easier for others to hold. By becoming harder for themselves to hear. That is one of the deepest heartbreaks of the feminine path. And for a long time, it can feel normal. Normal to people please. Normal to overgive. Normal to minimize your needs. Normal to stay too long. Normal to keep explaining your worth to people who benefit most from you doubting it. But divine feminine awakening changes what feels normal. That is what makes it so disruptive. Because the old strategies do not instantly disappear. At first, you may still try to do what you have always done. You may still try to be understanding. Still try to be patient. Still try to be loving in the ways you were taught. Still try to make room for everyone, soften every hard edge, absorb every discomfort, and keep the peace even when your own inner world is quietly fracturing. But now something new happens. It hurts more. That is the sign. The old self-betrayal starts costing more than it used to. Not because you are becoming difficult, because you are becoming conscious. And consciousness changes the cost of everything. Before awakening, you may have said yes and felt a little tired. Now you say yes when you mean no, and your whole body feels heavy. Your chest tightens. Your energy drops. Your spirit feels far away from you. Before awakening, you may have accepted mixed energy and love and told yourself to be understanding. Now confusion feels unbearable. Half presence feels exhausting. Emotional inconsistency feels like a wound your soul no longer wants to call romance. Before awakening, you may have over-explained your feelings to make others comfortable. Now every extra explanation feels like leaving yourself behind again. This is what it means to no longer betray yourself comfortably. Not that you become instantly perfect at boundaries. Not that you never overgive again. Not that you stop struggling overnight. But the betrayal no longer feels seamless. Now there is friction. Inner friction. And that friction is sacred. Because friction means your soul is no longer in agreement with the old pattern. That matters more than most people realize. Because many people wait for awakening to feel empowering first. They expect it to come with confidence, strength, and clean clarity. But often, before power feels like power, it feels like discomfort. It feels like realizing you can no longer keep living in ways that disconnect you from yourself, without feeling the full cost. That cost is the beginning of feminine truth. You may start noticing it everywhere. In relationships where you always carry the emotional weight. In friendships where you're listened to, but not truly felt. In family dynamics where your role has always been to regulate everyone else. In workspaces where your energy is used, but your inner life is ignored. In love, especially, where you confuse longing with alignment and patience with self-erasure. The awakening starts making these things visible in the body. That is why so many women entering divine feminine awakening suddenly feel less tolerant, or more reactive. But often, it is not reactivity in the shallow sense. It is the soul's refusal becoming embodied. The refusal to keep disappearing. The refusal to keep making your body carry what your voice is afraid to say. The refusal to keep sacrificing peace for proximity. The refusal to keep offering sacred energy into places that only know how to consume it. This is a profound threshold. Because once a woman can no longer betray herself comfortably, she begins changing from the inside out. She may still feel afraid, still feel uncertain, still fear disappointing others. But now, beneath the fear, something stronger is rising. Self-loyalty. That is one of the deepest signs of the awakened feminine. Not pride, not hardness, not ego. Self-loyalty. The willingness to remain with yourself even when that means someone else does not get the version of you they were used to. That can feel terrifying. Because many women were conditioned to believe that being loved required being easy to access. Easy to lean on, easy to misunderstand, easy to overuse. So when awakening begins making self-betrayal unbearable, the old fear speaks loudly. If I stop giving this way, will I still be loved? If I stop over-explaining, will they leave? If I stop shrinking, will there still be room for me here? If I finally honor what I feel, what will it cost me? These are not small fears. They are ancient fears. The fear that authenticity costs belonging. The fear that truth costs love. The fear that if you stop abandoning yourself for connection, connection may disappear. This is why sign 5 is so sacred. Because this is where the divine feminine begins choosing truth over false safety. Not recklessly, not perfectly, but increasingly. And that choice changes everything. You start noticing how much of your suffering was tied not only to what others did, but to the places where you kept cooperating with your own disappearance. That realization can be painful, because it asks for responsibility, not blame. Responsibility for where you kept saying yes to what hurt, where you kept giving your energy to what only depleted you, where you kept waiting for love to become clear instead of listening to how unclear love was already, making your body feel. That is not easy to face, but it is liberating, because once you see those patterns, you can stop calling them fate. You can start calling them what they were: misalignment. And misalignment loses power the moment it becomes conscious. This is why people-pleasing often starts feeling physically painful during awakening. Before, it may have felt like kindness. Now it feels like self-erasure. Before, overgiving may have felt like love. Now it feels like depletion. Before, pretending may have felt like maturity. Now it feels like betrayal. That is not regression. That is the feminine becoming too honest to keep decorating what drains her. And this honesty is magnetic. Not because it is loud, because it is real. A woman who can no longer betray herself comfortably begins moving differently. She becomes less available for emotional confusion, less available for empty validation, less available for one-sided devotion, less available for the old roles that asked her to abandon herself and call it virtue. This does not always make life simpler at first. In fact, it can make everything feel more intense for a while. Relationships may strain. Old identities may crack. Certain people may not understand the new boundaries forming inside you, especially if they benefited from your old softness without ever honoring your truth. But that intensity is not a sign that awakening is wrong. It is a sign that the old agreement is breaking. The agreement that said, I will leave myself in order to stay connected. That agreement cannot survive divine feminine awakening forever. Because the awakened feminine would rather disappoint what is false than remain disconnected from herself. That is a powerful truth. And it is why this sign often changes the whole spiritual path. Because now awakening is not just something you feel internally. It starts changing how you move externally. You pause before saying yes. You notice the contraction sooner. You feel the energetic cost of overgiving faster. You begin honoring your no before it becomes resentment. You become less willing to translate your intuition into something softer, just so other people do. Not feel uncomfortable. This is not selfishness. It is self-return. And self-return is one of the holiest forms of feminine awakening there is. So if you are in a season where people-pleasing feels painful, where overgiving leaves your body exhausted, where pretending feels almost unbearable, where your soul no longer lets you abandon yourself in relationships, work, family, or love without feeling it deeply, do not dismiss that. Do not call it too much. You may be standing inside one of the clearest signs of divine feminine awakening. You can no longer betray yourself comfortably. And once that line is crossed, something beautiful begins rising too. Because when self-betrayal becomes unbearable, external validation starts losing some of its power. You stop needing the world to tell you what your soul already knows. And that is where the next sign begins. Your intuition gets louder than approval. Chapter 7, Sign 6. Your intuition gets louder than external validation. There comes a moment in divine feminine awakening when something begins to reverse inside you. For years, maybe even for most of your life, you may have looked outward first. Outward for answers. Outward for reassurance. Outward for confirmation that what you felt was real. Outward for permission to trust yourself. Outward for signs that your heart was not wrong, your body was not overreacting, your instincts were not too much, too emotional, too irrational, too feminine. This is how many women are conditioned to live. Not from inner knowing, but from external permission. Permission to speak. Permission to leave. Permission to want more. Permission to say no. Permission to trust the subtle discomfort before it becomes obvious suffering. And for a long time, that conditioning can feel normal. You learn to doubt yourself first. To ask others what they think before honoring what you feel. To wait for evidence before trusting intuition. To look for red flags only after your body has already been waving them in silence for months. But then awakening begins. And something changes. Not all at once. Not loudly. But unmistakably. Your intuition gets louder than external validation. That is the sixth sign. And this sign is profound because it marks a major spiritual shift in where your authority lives. Before awakening, your authority may have been outsourced. To other people's opinions. To other people's choices. To what they said they felt. To whether they texted, stayed, chose, explained, reassured, committed, approved, or understood. If they validated you, you felt safer. If they withdrew, you questioned yourself. If they were inconsistent, you became confused. If they said the right words, you overrode what your body already knew. That is external dependence. Not because you were weak. Because you were trained to trust proof more than perception. But the divine feminine does not awaken through proof alone. She awakens through knowing. A knowing that often arrives before evidence. A knowing that lives in the body before it reaches the mind. A knowing that says, this is off. This is true. This is not enough. This is not safe. This is not aligned. Even when nothing on the surface has fully proven it yet. That is why this stage can feel so disorienting and so empowering at the same time. Because now you begin sensing misalignment before the outer world catches up. You feel distance before silence becomes official. You feel dishonesty before the facts appear. You feel depletion before the relationship visibly breaks. You feel truth before approval arrives. This changes how you move. Not immediately perfectly, but deeply. You begin hesitating before overriding yourself. You begin noticing how often your body knows first. You begin realizing how much suffering came not from lacking intuition, but from not trusting it. That realization is powerful, because it means you were never truly disconnected from your own truth. You were disconnected from your permission to honor it. And when the divine feminine begins rising, that permission starts coming from within. That is the shift. You stop needing the outside world to constantly confirm what your soul already senses. Not because you become arrogant, because you become rooted. There is a quiet authority in that. A sacred kind of authority. Not the authority that needs to dominate, argue, or prove. The authority that says, I know what I feel. I know what this costs me. I know what my body is saying. I know what my spirit recognizes. And I no longer need everyone else to agree before I honor it. That is divine feminine power. And it often arrives after years of self-doubt. Years of asking, am I overthinking this? Am I just too emotional? Am I imagining the misalignment? Maybe I need more patience. Maybe I am asking for too much. Maybe if I just stay softer, quieter, easier, they will finally meet me. But awakening begins ending that pattern. You stop negotiating with your own intuition so aggressively. Not because you never question anything again, but because the voice inside you gets harder to betray. That is what this sign really means. Your intuition does not just get louder. Your betrayal of intuition becomes more painful. That is a huge difference. Because before awakening, you may have ignored your own knowing and simply felt a little discomfort. Now, if you ignore it, the cost is much heavier. Your body tightens faster. Your energy drains faster. Your spirit feels farther away. The misalignment becomes almost physically unbearable. Why? Because the awakened feminine is not content to live by external validation anymore. She wants alignment. And alignment is an inner experience before it is an outer result. This is why so many women entering awakening suddenly feel less impressed by appearances. Words matter less than energy. Promises matter less than consistency. Attention matters less than truth. Validation matters less than peace. That is not cynicism. That is discernment. And discernment is one of the most beautiful signs of awakening. Because now you are no longer asking, do they approve of me? You are beginning to ask, does this align with what I already know? That question is life-changing. It changes your relationships, your boundaries, your decisions, your spiritual path, even your understanding of love. Because once intuition gets louder than external validation, you stop using other people's behavior as the final authority on your worth. That is a massive shift. If they choose you, you are not suddenly valuable. If they misunderstand you, you are not suddenly false. If they leave, you are not suddenly less intuitive. If they cannot meet your depth, you are not suddenly too much. This is one of the deepest forms of healing. The feminine within you begins separating her identity from external mirrors. She stops waiting for the world to tell her who she is. She begins remembering what her body knows, what her spirit knows, what her peace knows, what her exhaustion has been trying to teach her, what her longing has been revealing all along. This does not mean you never want affirmation again. It means affirmation stops being your foundation. Your foundation becomes inward. And once your foundation becomes inward, something extraordinary happens. You become less easy to manipulate, less easy to confuse, less easy to keep in false cycles, less easy to pull in and out of energetic instability with breadcrumbs, promises, mixed signals, or emotional half-truths. Why? Because you are no longer primarily listening for what they say. You are listening for what your inner world knows. That makes you more sovereign. More feminine, not less. More open, not less. More receptive, but not more gullible. This is why intuition getting louder is not just a spiritual gift. It is a reclaiming of feminine authority. For many women, authority was always coded as masculine. Loud, certain, logical, visible, externally validated. But divine feminine authority is different. It is subtle, but undeniable. It listens inward. It senses first. It trusts the body. It honors energetic truth before outer performance. And because of that, it often appears unreasonable to people who only trust what can be measured outwardly. But the feminine was never designed to live only by measurement. She was designed to know. That knowing is awakening now. You may notice it in small ways. You leave conversations sooner. You stop asking 5 people for advice before making one inner decision. You no longer need 100 signs to confirm what your spirit already feels. You recognize misalignment faster. You become less willing to explain away the contractions in your body just because the outer situation still looks fine. These are not random behavioral shifts. They are signs that your inner feminine authority is becoming more trusted than external noise. And that trust changes everything. Because once intuition gets louder than validation, you begin making choices from alignment instead of approval. You stop saying yes just because someone wants access to you. You stop waiting for perfect proof before honoring what already feels true. You stop treating your inner knowing like a draft that must be edited by everyone else's opinion. That is sacred. And yes, it can feel lonely at first. Because many people will not understand a woman who no longer needs their validation to hear herself clearly. Some may call her changed, too distant, too serious, too hard to access. But what is really happening is simpler. She is no longer available for the old ways of being led away from herself. That is not hardness. That is awakening. So if you are in a stage where your intuition feels louder than before, where external approval feels less satisfying, where you sense truth before proof arrives, where your body's knowing matters more than someone else's explanation, do not dismiss that. Do not call it imagination. Do not call it too sensitive. You may be standing inside one of the clearest signs of divine feminine awakening. Your inner authority is returning. And once that happens, another beautiful change begins unfolding. Because when intuition becomes stronger than validation, you also start craving something new. Not intensity. Not drama. Not confusion dressed as chemistry. You begin craving peace. Real peace. And that is where the seventh sign begins. Chapter 8, Sign 7. You start craving peace more than drama. There comes a point in divine feminine awakening when something that once felt magnetic no longer feels nourishing. Something that once looked like passion starts feeling like exhaustion. Something that once looked like chemistry starts feeling like dysregulation. Something that once kept your heart activated starts feeling like a pattern your soul no longer wants to call love. And this is where the seventh sign appears. You start craving peace more than drama. This is a profound sign. Because before awakening, many women are unconsciously drawn to intensity. Not because they are foolish. Not because they want pain. But because the nervous system often confuses intensity with aliveness. If love is unpredictable, it feels exciting. If someone is emotionally inconsistent, it feels consuming. If the connection is full of longing, silence, highs and lows, mixed signals, emotional heat, and aching anticipation, it can feel spiritual, faded, almost impossible to resist. Why? Because the body has often been conditioned to recognize familiar chaos faster than unfamiliar peace. That is one of the deepest wounds awakening begins healing. You start realizing that what you once called passion may have actually been anxiety. What you once called chemistry may have been old attachment wounds getting activated. What you once called a deep connection may have included a nervous system hooked on uncertainty, longing, and the emotional charge of not knowing where you stand. This realization can be shocking. Because when the divine feminine begins awakening, she does not only become more intuitive, she becomes less willing to romanticize chaos. That is the shift. You begin feeling the cost of drama more clearly. The waiting, the chasing, the confusion, the emotional whiplash, the attraction to what keeps you spiritually hungry but emotionally unstable. And suddenly something in you says, no more. Not from bitterness. Not from numbness. From wisdom. Because peace starts feeling more valuable than adrenaline. Truth starts feeling more seductive than mystery. Consistency starts feeling more beautiful than intensity. Reciprocity starts feeling more sacred than emotional fireworks. That is awakening. Not because you become boring, because your soul becomes too honest to keep calling dysregulation love. This is one of the most mature signs of the awakened feminine. You stop craving people who make you feel emotionally addicted. You stop worshiping what keeps you in suspense. You stop being impressed by attraction that comes without safety, truth, softness, or real presence. That shift changes everything. Because for many women, drama once felt like evidence of depth. If it hurt, it must matter. If it consumed you, it must be real. If it kept you longing, it must be sacred. If it challenged your peace, it must be transforming you. But awakening begins teaching a new language. A more accurate one. One that says, what if depth is not chaos? What if sacred love does not destroy your nervous system? What if peace is not boring but holy? What if the kind of love your feminine was always craving is not the one that keeps you activated, but the one that lets you soften without disappearing? That question changes the whole spiritual path. Because once you begin craving peace more than drama, your entire attraction pattern starts shifting. You become less available for hot and cold energy, less available for inconsistency that once felt magnetic, less available for being half met, less available for relationships that feed fantasy while starving your actual heart. This is not because you become less passionate. It is because you become more embodied. And an embodied feminine does not crave emotional hunger the same way. She may still feel deeply, still love deeply, still be drawn to intensity in the soul sense. But she no longer wants intensity that comes at the cost of her peace. That is a huge evolution, because the nervous system starts learning a new truth. Peace is not emptiness. Peace is not lack of passion. Peace is not the death of desire. Peace is the absence of distortion. And once you taste that, even a little, the old drama becomes much harder to romanticize. You may notice this first in your body. The old kind of attraction starts feeling heavy instead of exciting. The old emotional push-pull starts feeling tiring instead of intoxicating. The old anxious waiting starts feeling humiliating instead of meaningful. That does not mean you judge yourself for what you once wanted. It means you are changing. You are no longer available for the same energetic diet. The feminine in you has outgrown spiritual junk food. And now she wants something more real, more gentle, more reciprocal, more honest, more grounded, more whole. This often shocks people because they think awakening should make them want more love. And it does. But not more chaos. More truth. More safety. More reverence. More emotional coherence. More actual presence. That is why peace becomes so attractive. Not because it flatters the ego. Because it finally nourishes the soul. For a long time, drama may have kept you emotionally occupied. It gave the mind something to chase, decode, survive, hope through. It made the connection feel active. It made the heart feel engaged in a story full of tension, longing, and movement. But peace asks for something much more intimate. Stillness. Stillness enough to feel what is real. Stillness enough to let your body settle. Stillness enough to stop using emotional chaos as proof that something matters. That stillness can feel deeply unfamiliar at first. In fact, many women entering this sign think they are losing spark. They think, why am I less attracted to this? Why doesn't this push-pull excite me like before? Why does drama suddenly feel so draining? Why do I want calm more than intensity? And the answer is not that you are becoming less alive. You are becoming less willing to call suffering intimacy. That is a sacred shift. Because once you crave peace more than drama, you stop organizing your spiritual life around emotional turbulence. You stop confusing longing with alignment. You stop making yourself available to what only awakens your wounds while calling it fate. Instead, you begin craving a very different kind of love. A love that feels soft in the body. A love that does not require guessing games. A love that does not ask for your self-abandonment as proof of depth. A love that allows your nervous system to exhale instead of constantly brace. That is divine feminine wisdom. And it changes the kind of relationships you are willing to enter, sustain, and call sacred. You begin valuing clarity over mixed signals, presence over intensity, consistency over chemistry spikes, truth over fantasy, reciprocity over emotional crumbs. That is not settling. That is rising. Because the awakened feminine is not hungry for what wounds her and calls itself passion. She is hungry for what meets her. And being met is peaceful. Not because it is dull. Because it is real. This is why sign 7 is so powerful. It reveals that awakening is changing not only what you feel, but what your entire system is willing to call love. And once that changes, everything changes. Your attraction, your boundaries, your standards, your choices, your spiritual path. You begin realizing that some of what you once chased was not your soul speaking. It was your conditioning, your old attachment system, your old wound pattern, your old belief that love must hurt in order to be meaningful. Now the feminine in you is remembering something deeper. Love should not constantly make you leave yourself. That memory is awakening. And as it awakens, drama loses some of its shine. Not because your heart is closing, because your heart is maturing. You no longer crave the emotional roller coaster. You no longer want the connection that keeps you spiritually starving while calling itself destiny. You no longer want to feel chosen for a moment and abandoned in the next breath. You want peace. Not shallow peace. Sacred peace. The kind of peace that comes when truth, softness, clarity, and reciprocity meet in the same space. That is one of the clearest signs that divine feminine awakening is becoming embodied. Because the feminine is no longer looking for a love that proves itself through chaos. She is becoming available for a love that can finally honor her nervous system, her intuition, her body, and her truth. And that is not the end of desire. It is the end of distortion. So if you feel yourself craving peace more than drama, if what once excited you now feels exhausting, if confusion no longer feels romantic, if intensity without truth no longer feels spiritual, if you find yourself longing for softness, honesty, coherence, and calm, do not dismiss that as losing passion. You may be standing in the 7th sign of awakening. Your soul is changing what it is willing to call love. And once that happens, a deeper truth becomes impossible to ignore. Divine feminine awakening was never about becoming someone new. It was always about returning to the self you left behind. Chapter 9: The Deep Truth. Divine feminine awakening is a return to self. If we strip away all the language, all the labels, all the spiritual aesthetics, all the social media images of what awakening is supposed to look like, we arrive at one of the deepest truths of all. Divine feminine awakening is not becoming someone new. It is returning to the self you abandoned. That is the real mystery. And that is why the journey feels so emotional, so disruptive, so sacred. Because awakening is rarely about adding something foreign to you. It is about remembering what was always yours before fear, conditioning, trauma, people-pleasing, performance, heartbreak, and survival taught you to leave it behind. This is why the awakening can feel both ancient and completely new at the same time. It feels new because you are living it consciously now. But it feels ancient because some part of you has always known this self. The self who felt deeply. The self who knew quietly. The self who did not need to chase what was true. The self who was intuitive before she was taught to doubt herself. the self who was soft without being weak, the self who was receptive without being self-abandoning, the self who could feel love without losing her own center. That self was never truly gone. She was buried beneath adaptation, buried beneath emotional labor, buried beneath the endless pressure to be chosen, approved of, easy, useful, patient, and pleasing, buried beneath every moment you overrode your intuition to stay connected, buried beneath every version of love that asked you to leave your own body in order to remain available. This is why awakening often feels like grief, because you are not only waking up to spiritual truth, you are waking up to how far you drifted from yourself. That realization hurts. It hurts to see where you abandoned your knowing, where you made yourself smaller to be loved, where you called overgiving devotion, where you confused being wanted with being cherished, where you kept waiting for someone else to return to you while you were still leaving yourself in small, quiet ways every day. That is the heartbreak of awakening. And it is also its beauty, because once you see where you left yourself, you can begin returning. That is what divine feminine awakening truly is. Not ascension into someone unreal, but return to the woman who was always there beneath the distortion. That woman may have been hidden for years, hidden behind strength, behind busyness, behind overthinking, behind self-control, behind the need to survive. But hidden is not the same as gone. An awakening begins the moment your soul becomes too honest to keep living against her. That line matters, because this path is not really about perfection. It is about honesty. The honesty to say, this is not enough. This hurts. This drains me. This does not honor me. This is not love. This is not truth. I cannot keep doing this to myself and call it healing. That kind of honesty is feminine power. Not because it dominates, because it remembers. It remembers what peace feels like in the body. It remembers what self-trust feels like before proof. It remembers what love feels like when it does not require self-erasure. It remembers that softness and strength were never enemies. This is why the awakening can feel like remembrance more than achievement. You are not becoming worthy. You are remembering the worth you abandoned. You are not becoming intuitive. You are remembering the intuition you learned to silence. You are not becoming magnetic. You are remembering the energy that naturally arises when you stop betraying yourself. That is why the journey feels sacred. Because it is not about building the feminine from scratch. It is about removing what buried her. Removing the false stories, the fear-based roles, the habits of shrinking, the addiction to external validation, the attraction to what wounds you and calls itself chemistry, the belief that love must cost you yourself in order to be real. Each layer that falls away is not making you less. It is making you more visible to yourself. That is a holy kind of return. And this is why divine feminine awakening is so deeply tied to self-trust. Because once the return begins, you stop relating to yourself as someone who must constantly be corrected by the outside world. You begin listening inward, feeling inward, choosing inward. Not because the outer world no longer matters, but because it no longer gets to define your truth. That is a massive shift. For many women, life has been lived from the outside in. How do they see me? Do they choose me? Do they approve? Do they understand? Do they validate what I feel? But awakening reverses the direction. Now the question becomes, do I choose this? Does this honor me? Does this bring me peace? Does this align with what I already know inwardly? Am I still with myself here? That last question may be the deepest of all, because divine feminine awakening is a return to self. And self is not an abstract idea here. Self means the one inside you who stays. The one who witnesses your pain without abandoning you in it. The one who honors your body's truth. The one who no longer asks you to betray your peace to earn love. The one who no longer turns your sensitivity into shame. That self is sacred. And when she returns, the whole spiritual path changes. You stop chasing what is not aligned. Stop bargaining with confusion. Stop romanticizing what destabilizes your nervous system. Stop treating your intuition like a draft that needs external editing. Stop waiting for the world to tell you what your soul already knows. That is why awakening is not dramatic in the egoic sense. It is revolutionary in the soulful sense. It changes how you stand in relationships, how you move through uncertainty, how you hear your body, how you define love, how you feel worth, how you respond to silence, longing, truth, softness, and your own needs. This is also why the awakened feminine becomes less available for what once seemed irresistible. Not because she is closed, because she is home. And once a woman begins coming home to herself, anything that asks her to become lost again starts feeling deeply unnatural. That is not coldness. That is coherence. It means your inner world is beginning to agree with itself again. The body and intuition. The heart and boundaries, the softness and the standards, the love and the self-respect. These things were never meant to be at war. But many women were taught that to be loving meant to be porous. To be feminine meant to be endlessly accommodating. To be spiritual meant to endure. To be worthy of devotion meant to remain open even to what dishonors your truth. Awakening shatters those lies. And what rises in their place is something infinitely more beautiful. A woman who can remain open without leaving herself. A woman who can feel deeply without drowning. A woman who can love without making love an altar of self-abandonment. That is the return. That is the real meaning of divine feminine awakening. Not becoming ethereal. Not becoming perfect. Becoming unavailable for the self who had to disappear in order to survive. This is why the deepest sentence of this chapter may be this. Divine feminine awakening begins the moment your soul becomes too honest to keep living against itself. Read that slowly, because that is the threshold. The soul becomes too honest to call misalignment patience. Too honest to call depletion love. Too honest to call anxiety chemistry. Too honest to call self-erasure feminine softness. Too honest to keep handing your inner authority over to external approval. That honesty can feel like loss at first, because you may lose tolerance, lose roles, lose illusions, lose relationships that only worked when you were disconnected from yourself. But what you gain is beyond comparison. You gain yourself, not in a selfish way, in a sacred way. The self who listens, the self who stays, the self who feels peace as a spiritual standard, the self who no longer begs the world to tell her what she already knows. That self is rising. And if these signs have been showing up in your life, the sensitivity, the solitude, the grief, the loss of tolerance, the return of intuition, the craving for peace, then what is happening is not random. You are remembering the woman underneath the survival patterns, the woman underneath the performance, the woman underneath the long years of adjusting yourself to be loved. That remembrance is awakening. And once you understand that, the final message of this video becomes clear. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are not falling apart. You may be returning to the deepest version of yourself you have touched in a very long time. And that changes everything. Chapter 10, the final truth. You are not breaking down. You are becoming more true. So now we arrive at the final truth. Not the comforting version. Not the surface level version. Not the polished spiritual version that says awakening is always beautiful, graceful, and easy to understand while you are living inside it, but the deeper truth. The one your soul may have been trying to whisper to you this whole time. If you have felt the sensitivity, the exhaustion, the grief, the need for solitude, the loss of tolerance, the rising intuition, the sudden craving for peace over drama, then maybe what is happening is not that you are becoming too much. Maybe you are becoming too true to keep living in what no longer fits. That is the final message of this journey. You are not breaking down. You are becoming more honest. More honest about what drains you. More honest about what your body can no longer tolerate. More honest about what your heart actually needs. More honest about where you have abandoned yourself in the name of love, peace, loyalty, patience, or being good. That honesty can feel brutal at first. Because once truth begins rising, the old life starts feeling smaller. The old roles feel heavier. The old relationships feel louder. The old patterns feel more painful. The old version of you, the one who could survive by self-silencing, overgiving, over-explaining, over-functioning, and calling that maturity, begins to fall apart. And yes, that can feel like loss. But what if it is not loss? What if it is shedding? Shedding what was never your deepest self. Shedding what you had to become to survive. Shedding what the world taught you to call femininity, even when it cost you your center. Because true femininity was never about disappearing. It was never about endless tolerance. Never about being easy to consume. Never about staying soft in a way that let the world erase your truth. The divine feminine does not awaken to become more agreeable. She awakens to become more real. That is what this whole path has been asking of you. Not to become someone more impressive. To become someone more embodied. Someone who can feel without abandoning herself. Someone who can love without calling pain devotion. Someone who can listen inwardly without asking the outside world to constantly approve what she knows. Someone who can stay open without becoming porous to everything that drains, confuses, or dishonors her. That is sacred power. And it does not always arrive looking powerful. Sometimes it arrives through tears, through fatigue, through endings, through silence, through realizing you can no longer betray yourself and still call it peace. That is not weakness. That is awakening. Because awakening rarely begins as confidence. It begins as disruption. It disrupts what was false, what was tolerated, what was normalized, what was inherited, what was performed, what was survived. And in that disruption, something truer starts emerging. At first, she is quiet. Maybe she only speaks through your body, through the way your chest tightens in certain spaces, through how tired you feel after certain conversations, through how impossible it now feels to keep saying yes when your spirit means no. Then she gets stronger. She begins to sound like intuition, like discernment, like grief that tells the truth, like a standard for peace you can no longer betray, like a woman inside you who says, I cannot keep living this way. That woman is not your enemy. She is your return. She is the self you left behind while trying to survive. The self who knew before she could prove. The self who felt before she could explain. The self who was soft without being naive. Open without being lost. Loving without being self-abandoning. She has always been there. And maybe that is the deepest comfort of all. You are not becoming something foreign to yourself. You are remembering. Remembering what your body already knew. Remembering what your soul always wanted. Remembering what peace feels like. Remembering that your sensitivity was never the problem. Remembering that your intuition was never too much. remembering that your need for truth was never unreasonable. That remembrance changes everything. It changes what you allow, what you call love, what you call chemistry, what you call safety, what you call devotion, what you call feminine, and it changes how you see yourself. No longer as someone too emotional, too sensitive, too deep, too affected, but as someone awakening into coherence. Coherence between body and soul, between truth and action, between softness and self-respect, between openness and inner authority. That is what divine feminine awakening really gives you. Not just spiritual language, a new internal reality, one where peace becomes sacred, one where self-betrayal becomes impossible to romanticize, one where your inner knowing becomes more trustworthy than outer approval, one where the version of love you are available for begins changing forever. And yes, that may mean losing certain things. Old patterns, old identities, old dynamics, old illusions, old tolerances, old dreams that were built on pain instead of truth. But what you gain is far greater. You gain your own presence, your own voice, your own boundaries, your own inner throne, your own permission to live in a way that does not require you to split from yourself to stay connected. That is a holy gain. So if you are in the middle of this right now, if you feel raw, inward, tired, more sensitive than usual, less tolerant of what is false, more aware of grief, more pulled towards solitude, more desperate for peace than ever before, please hear this clearly. Nothing may be wrong with you. You may simply be at the sacred beginning of becoming impossible to live against. And that is a blessing. A painful blessing, perhaps, but still a blessing. Because the woman who can no longer betray herself comfortably is the woman who is getting ready to live differently, love differently, choose differently, speak differently, rest differently, receive differently. She is not lost. She is rising. Not always loudly. Not always in ways the world understands. Not always with perfect words. But truly. And once that truth starts rising, the old version of life can never fully contain her again. That is what awakening means. Not that you stop being tender. That your tenderness finally becomes aligned with truth. Not that you stop loving. That your love stops asking you to disappear. Not that you become someone flawless. That you become someone who can no longer comfortably live disconnected from herself. That is the miracle. And that is why this chapter ends not with fear, but with reverence. Reverence for the grief. Reverence for the sensitivity. Reverence for the exhaustion that called you home. Reverence for the solitude that gave your soul room to speak. Reverence for the woman inside you who got tired of surviving and began remembering. If she is waking up in you now, trust her. Trust what no longer fits. Trust what no longer feels peaceful. Trust what your body is trying to tell you. Trust what your soul is refusing to tolerate any longer. Because sometimes the first sign of sacred becoming is that the old self can no longer comfortably remain. And if that is true, then you are not at the end of yourself. You are at the beginning of a more embodied life, a more intuitive life, a more truthful life, a more feminine life in the deepest sense, not softer for the world, but truer to the soul. That is what is being born. And it is beautiful even here, even before you fully understand it. If this message found you at exactly the right time, write in the comments. She is rising. And if you are walking through divine feminine awakening, spiritual sensitivity, soul healing, and the return to your deepest truth, subscribe to the channel, because here we go beyond surface spirituality and into the real inner transformation behind feminine awakening. And if this video spoke to you, Share it with someone who feels like they are falling apart when in truth, they may be standing at the sacred beginning of becoming more whole, more intuitive, and more true than ever before.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.